History doesn't sleep. Welcome to History Speaks, the show where we bring a figure from the past into the present and ask them to make sense of the world we've built. This week, 5 stories about power, who holds it, who loses it, and who was never allowed to have it in the first place. 1. The US-Israel war on Iran has entered its 4th week. Iran rejected America's 15-point peace proposal as maximalist and unreasonable. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil and gas normally flows, remains closed. Ceasefire negotiations have stalled. 2. A new UN Women report reveals that only 1 in 7 nations on Earth is currently led by a woman. Women's share of cabinet positions has fallen for the first time in years. At the current rate, gender parity in global political leadership will not arrive for another 130 years. 3. The World Trade Organization held its 14th Ministerial Conference in Yaoundé, Cameroon, the first on African soil, as the Director General warned that the rules-based trading order is in crisis. 4. China's National People's Congress formally adopted the 15th Five-Year Plan. Its center of gravity, artificial intelligence, referenced 13 times more than semiconductors. Beijing is playing a longer game than Washington has noticed. 5. The United States Supreme Court struck down President Trump's sweeping emergency tariffs in a 6-3 ruling. 2 of his own appointees joined the majority. 24 states immediately filed new challenges to his remaining trade tools. 5 stories, all of them in different ways about the same question: who controls the choke points of oil, of trade, of power, of representation, and what happens when that control is challenged? Our guest this week controlled the choke point that fed the ancient world. She was born in Alexandria, Egypt in 69 BC, a city that was, at the time, the intellectual capital of the known world. The last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, she was the first in her 300-year family line to learn the Egyptian language. She also spoke Latin, Aramaic, Ethiopian, Hebrew, and 4 others. Not as a curiosity, as a weapon. She negotiated with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony as equals at a time when Rome commanded armies that could have absorbed Egypt in a season. She kept her kingdom independent for 21 years through a combination of political intelligence, strategic alliance, and what ancient observers described as the most compelling personal presence they had ever encountered. When she finally lost, defeated at Actium by Octavian in 31 BC, she did not surrender. She took her own life at 39. Her last recorded words, "I will not be triumphed over." She was right. 2,000 years later, we are still talking about her. Cleopatra, welcome to 2026.
2026. A war over a strait. A conference in Africa about the rules of trade. A court that tells its ruler he has exceeded his authority. And a report, issued, I am told, by a committee of the United Nations, informing the world that only 1 in 7 nations is led by a woman. 2,000 years. And this still requires a report. Let us begin.
Our first story. The US-Israel-Iran war is now in its 4th week. Brent crude has risen above $82 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage between Iran and Oman, through which nearly 20% of global oil and liquefied natural gas normally passes, remains blocked. This week, Iran formally rejected the United States' 15-point peace proposal, calling it maximalist and unreasonable. Tehran issued its own counter-proposal, demanding war reparations, sovereignty guarantees over the strait, and ironclad assurances against future attack. The gap between the 2 positions remains vast. Pakistan is reportedly serving as a back-channel mediator. Iran's foreign ministry insists that the exchange of messages does not constitute formal negotiations. Cleopatra. Egypt controlled the grain supply that fed Rome. You spent your reign managing a kingdom that held something the most powerful empire in the world could not do without. You know what it means to control a choke point, and what it means to negotiate from that position. What do you see when you look at the Strait of Hormuz?
Egypt fed Rome. Let me say that plainly, because it tends to be forgotten in accounts that prefer to focus on my relationships with powerful men rather than the strategic foundations of my kingdom. Egypt produced the grain that sustained the Roman population. The Nile gave us a harvest that no other territory in the Mediterranean could match. Caesar did not come to Alexandria because he found me charming. He came because he could not afford for Egypt to fall into the wrong hands. That is what a choke point is. It is not merely geography, it is necessity. The Strait of Hormuz is not valuable because it is narrow. It is valuable because the world chose to build its energy architecture around what flows through it. Whoever holds that strait does not need an army as large as Rome's. They need only the credibility to close it, and the willingness to absorb the pain of doing so. Iran has demonstrated both. Now, to the peace proposal. The Americans offered 15 points. Iran called them maximalist and unreasonable, and issued a counter-proposal demanding reparations and sovereignty guarantees. The gap is vast, we are told. Of course it is. That is not a failure of diplomacy. That is diplomacy. No ruler who has not yet been broken accepts terms that require them to dismantle what they spent decades building as the condition of peace. I know this because I sat across from Julius Caesar, a man who had just defeated his rival in civil war and commanded the most powerful military force in the world. And I did not offer him my surrender. I offered him an alliance. The question for any mediator, and Pakistan is wise to play this role quietly, is not whether the gap can be bridged. Gaps can always be bridged. The question is whether both parties have reached the point at which continued fighting costs more than the terms on the table. That point has not yet arrived. It will. It always does. What concerns me more is this. The strait is not merely an instrument of war. It is an instrument of trade. Every week it remains closed. The countries that depend on it build alternatives, new routes, new suppliers, new relationships. Choke points derive their power from the belief that they cannot be circumvented. The longer a choke point is closed, the more the world learns to move around it. Egypt made this mistake with Rome in the end. We believed our grain was irreplaceable. Rome developed Sicilian and North African supply lines. Our leverage diminished precisely because we held it too long without resolution. Iran should study that history. Choke point power is real, but it has a half-life.
Our second story. On March 25th, UN Women and the Interparliamentary Union released their annual Women in Politics report. The findings are stark. Only 28 countries, roughly 1 in 7, are currently led by a woman head of state or government. 101 nations have never had a female leader at all. Women's share of cabinet minister positions fell to 22.4%, the first decline in years. The number of women serving as parliamentary speakers dropped nearly 4 percentage points in a single year, the first decline in 21 years. At the current rate of progress, the report projects that gender parity in top political leadership will not be achieved for another 130 years. Cleopatra, you ruled the most strategically vital kingdom in the ancient Mediterranean at a time when no Roman woman held formal political power. You negotiated with the 2 most powerful men in the world as their equal. Sometimes, their superior. And history spent 2,000 years discussing your personal life rather than your statecraft. What does 1 in 7 mean to you?
1 in 7. I will tell you what this number means. It means that of every 7 rulers who made decisions this week, decisions about war and peace, about tariffs and trade, about who receives aid and who does not, 6 of them were men. And the world expects us to find this surprising. I ruled Egypt for 21 years. I commanded armies. I managed a trade network that connected 3 continents. I conducted diplomacy with the 2 most powerful men alive. And I kept my kingdom independent for 2 decades at a time when Rome was absorbing every territory it touched. You know what history chose to discuss? My relationships with Caesar and Antony. Not the treaty terms I negotiated. Not the monetary policy I implemented. Egypt, under my rule, expanded its coinage system and stabilized its currency. Not the multilingual administration I built, or the fact that I was the first of my dynasty in 300 years to speak to Egyptians in their own language. Not the donations of Alexandria, by which I secured territory for my children that had not been under Egyptian control in generations. My alliances with powerful men. That is what they remember. That is what they decided was the center of my story. And you wonder why 1 in 7 nations is led by a woman. It is not because women are less capable of leadership. I would invite anyone who believes that to explain to me how a less capable ruler kept Egypt independent for 21 years between 2 of the most aggressive powers the ancient world ever produced. It is because the standards applied to women in power are not the standards applied to men. A man who forms alliances with powerful partners is called strategic. A woman who does the same is called something else entirely. A man who deploys his personal presence as a political instrument is called charismatic. A woman is called manipulative. A man who is defeated is a tragic figure. A woman who rises to power is an anomaly, an exception, a curiosity to be explained rather than a ruler to be reckoned with. 130 years. They said this 2,000 years ago in different language. They said it 100 years ago when the suffrage movements were in the streets. They say it now with charts and projections and working groups. The projection always moves forward, because the problem is not a pipeline problem or a representation problem. It is a recognition problem. The world does not yet fully accept that power, exercised by a woman, is still power, and not an exception to be explained or a threat to be managed. I will not be triumphed over. I said that as I was dying. I say it now. Those of you in positions to change this number, change it. Not in 130 years. Now,
Our third story. On March 26th, the World Trade Organization opened its 14th Ministerial Conference, MC14, in Yaoundé, Cameroon. It is the first WTO Ministerial ever held on African soil. Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala opened the conference with a call to reinvigorate the WTO in a time of crisis. The agenda includes persistent divisions over agriculture, fisheries subsidies, e-commerce rules, and access for least developed countries. A Western diplomat described the atmosphere as tense. The conference takes place against a backdrop of US unilateralism, the disruption of global shipping from the Iran war, and widespread questions about whether multilateral trade institutions built in the post-war era can survive an age of great power competition. Cleopatra, Alexandria was one of the great trading hubs of the ancient world. You managed a commerce system that connected Rome, the East, and Africa. You understood what trade rules actually are, not neutral law, but an arrangement that reflects who was powerful when the rules were written. What do you make of the world trying to save its trading order?
they are meeting in Africa to save rules that were written without Africa. I say this not as a criticism of the Director General. She is clearly a formidable woman, and I note with approval that she was chosen for this role, but as a structural observation. The rules-based trading order that the WTO was built to enforce reflects the priorities of the post-war Western world. The nations that had the most to gain from those rules shaped them most heavily. This is how all trade regimes work. It is how all legal systems work. It is how Alexandria worked. We were the center of Mediterranean trade for 3 centuries. I can tell you what rules-based trade looks like from the inside. The rules are real. They create predictability. They reduce friction. They allow merchants to plan across years rather than weeks. These are genuine goods. But the rules also have architects, and the architects build in the interests of the architecturally powerful. The deeper question before Yaoundé is this: are the nations that were not at the table when the rules were written willing to defend a system built without their input? At precisely the moment when the nations that did write those rules are now breaking them themselves. The United States imposed tariffs unilaterally. Its own Supreme Court has now ruled those tariffs illegal. The largest power in the system, the one that insisted most loudly on rules-based order, broke the rules when it was convenient and then asked the courts to clean up the mess. In my time, Rome had a similar relationship with its own laws. Roman law was magnificent, detailed, consistent, sophisticated, and Rome applied it selectively to those it chose to recognize as legal persons and suspended it for those it chose to conquer. The challenge for Yaoundé is this: you cannot rebuild trust in a multilateral system while the most powerful actor in that system is still demonstrating that the rules are optional for the powerful. The effort is worth making. I do not say otherwise. I say only, make it with clear eyes about what you are actually confronting.
Our 4th story. China's National People's Congress this month formally adopted its 15th 5-year plan covering 2026 to 2030. Analysts who studied the document found something striking. It mentions artificial intelligence 13 times more often than it mentions semiconductors. The plan commits to 4.5 to 5% GDP growth, a 17% reduction in carbon intensity, and designates biomedicine as a new pillar industry. But its defining ambition is AI supremacy, embedding artificial intelligence at the center of industrial policy, research, military development, and governance. One analyst wrote, "Washington remains focused on the chip war. Beijing has already moved the battlefield." Cleopatra. You built your power in the city of the greatest library in the ancient world. You understood that knowledge infrastructure is not a luxury. It is the foundation of every other advantage. Military power, trade leverage, diplomatic influence, all of it rests on who knows more than whom. What do you see when one empire plans for a decade while another manages a news cycle?
The Library of Alexandria. I know you expect me to speak of it with sentiment. I will not. I will speak of it as what it was: a strategic investment in epistemic supremacy. My Ptolemaic ancestors built the library not because they loved learning, though some of them did, but because they understood that the kingdom which controls the world's knowledge controls the terms of every conversation. Every scientific advance, every philosophical framework, every map of every coastline, every agricultural technique, if it was written down anywhere in the known world, Alexandria attempted to obtain a copy. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour were required to surrender any scrolls for copying before they were returned. We did not apologise for this. Knowledge was a resource. We treated it as one. China's 5-year plan understands this. Artificial intelligence referenced 13 times more than semiconductors. This tells you something important about the difference between a tactical understanding and a strategic one. Semiconductors are a tactical asset, a component in a supply chain, subject to embargo to export controls, to the accidents of geography. Artificial intelligence is something else entirely. It is a force multiplier for everything, for military capability, for economic productivity, for governance, for scientific research. A kingdom that leads in AI does not merely have better tools, it has better decisions, faster decisions, decisions made with more information than its rivals can access. This is what the library was, not a collection of scrolls, an advantage machine. Washington is fighting over components. Beijing is building the capability that makes components secondary. The analyst you quoted is correct. The battlefield has already moved. Rome was always a tactical power, devastating in the short engagement, flexible in execution. But it was reactive. It responded to threats with force. It did not invest in the kind of long-range thinking that builds civilizational advantage across generations. Alexandria did, and we remained the intellectual center of the world for 300 years. 5 years is a short plan, but the discipline of planning 5 years forward, consistently, generation after generation, is what separates institutions from events. The question for Washington is not how to win the chip war. It is whether it understands that the chip war is already the previous war.
Our final story. On February 20th, the United States Supreme Court handed down a ruling that is still reverberating across global trade. In a 6-3 decision, the court struck down President Trump's sweeping tariffs, imposed through the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, ruling that the law did not grant the president authority to set tariffs unilaterally. The majority opinion was written by Chief Justice Roberts. It was joined notably by Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, both appointed by Trump himself. 24 states have since filed additional legal challenges to the administration's remaining trade tools. The Trump administration has responded by launching slower statutory investigations against China, Mexico, the European Union, and Southeast Asian nations. The legal architecture of America's trade policy is now in fundamental uncertainty. Cleopatra, you were ousted by palace factions before you came back to reclaim your throne. You know what it feels like when the institutions closest to a ruler turn against him. And you know what that moment reveals about whether a ruler's authority is real or merely assumed. What does it mean when a ruler's own court curbs his power?
In the year 49 BC, I was driven from Alexandria by a palace faction that had convinced itself it was serving Egypt by removing me. My brother's advisors, Pothinus, Achilles, Theodotus, believed that with me gone, they would control the throne through a child king. They had the palace guard. They had the treasury seals. They had every formal instrument of power. And they were wrong, because formal power is not the same as actual power, and the institutions of a state are not the same as the state itself. I returned, with Caesar. I tell you this not to draw a direct parallel to a Supreme Court ruling. The situations differ in obvious ways, but because the underlying structural question is identical. When a ruler's own institutions constrain him, there are 3 possible responses. The first is to accept the constraint as legitimate, adjust, and govern within the new limits. This is the healthy response. It is also the rarest. The second is to fight the constraint, to attack the institution's legitimacy, to seek workarounds, to legislate new authority, to appoint more sympathetic members. This is the more common response. It usually fails, at great cost to the ruler and the institution both. The third is to ignore the ruling entirely, to proceed as though the court had not spoken and dare the institution to enforce itself. The Trump administration appears to be pursuing the second path, launching new statutory investigations, applying the same trade policy through different mechanisms. This is predictable. It is also expensive. It consumes political capital and legitimacy with every iteration. But here is what I find genuinely interesting. 2 of his own appointees joined the majority. Gorsuch and Barrett did not rule against executive overreach because they forgot who placed them on the court. They ruled because the alternative, endorsing unlimited executive tariff authority, was a precedent they were not willing to create, even for a president they owed. The advisors who drove me from Alexandria in 49 BC also believed they were serving a principle larger than any individual ruler. They were not. They were serving their own positions. But they believed it. The question for every ruler is not whether the institutions will eventually constrain you. They will. The question is whether you have governed in a way that earns genuine loyalty when the moment of constraint arrives. Pothinus did not have that loyalty. The army followed Caesar. Caesar followed me. The advisors who drive rulers from power rarely survive the return.
Cleopatra, you have held a kingdom between empires, managed the world's most important trade choke point, ruled while being scrutinized in ways no male ruler has ever faced, and built your legacy in a city whose name still means knowledge itself. Before we return you to Alexandria, or wherever 2,000 years have placed you, is there anything you would leave with our listeners?
You ask what I would leave with your listeners. I will say this. I came to power at 18. I was driven from it by a faction that believed I was replaceable. I returned because I understood something they did not, that power is not a position. It is not a title or a throne or a set of institutional instruments. Power is the ability to make others see their own interest in your survival. Caesar saw his interest in mine. Antony saw his. The merchants of Alexandria saw theirs. The priests of Isis saw theirs. That is how I kept Egypt independent for 21 years, between the 2 most aggressive empires the ancient world had ever produced. Every story you discuss today is a version of this question. Iran and America are negotiating the point at which each side sees its interest in the other's compromise. The WTO members are deciding whether they see their interest in the system's survival. China is building an advantage that others will one day need to negotiate with. And the Supreme Court justices decided that the rule of law was in their interest to protect, even against the president who appointed them. And 1 in 7 women leads a nation, because the other 6 in 7 have not yet fully reckoned with the cost of the talent they are leaving unused. Every empire believes it will be the last. Alexandria believed this too. We were wrong about the duration. We were not wrong about the library. Build the library.
Cleopatra, the last queen of a 300-year dynasty. Still, 2,000 years later, the most discussed woman in political history. That is History Speaks for the week of March 28, 2026. Next week, a new voice from across the centuries. Head to our YouTube community tab, Instagram, or X to cast your vote. If this episode left you reconsidering what you thought you knew about power, good. That is also the point. History Speaks. New episodes every Friday. On YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen. Until next week. Every empire believes it will be the last.